My name's Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our capstone conference on faith-inspired development work, lessons learned, and next steps. We want to use this time together, as the title suggests, to look back and to look forward. For about 5 years now, under the leadership of my colleague Catherine Marshall, with the generous support of the Luce Foundation, and in collaboration with the World Phase Development Dialogue, an NGO that Catherine runs, which is based at the center, we've been exploring the intersections of religion and economic and social development in depth. Quite a lot of exciting work has been done, and we're delighted to welcome here today for this stocktaking many of the participants in that work, people who will share time with us on the panel, but also many members of the audience, for an opportunity to reflect on what we've learned and how we might chart a path forward, particularly in the context of the Millennium Development Goals and the challenges that they pose. I'm going to turn things over to Catherine in a minute to give you more of a sense of the background for the project and what we hope to accomplish today, but I thought I'd say a couple words about the Berkley Center and our work here at Georgetown. The center's been around now 5.5 years, and we're part of a university-wide effort to promote the interdisciplinary study of religion, to advance interreligious understanding. And in particular at the center, our research, teaching, and outreach is designed to explore this intersection between religion and world affairs, the ways in which religion intersects with global challenges of democracy and human rights, of interfaith dialogue, diplomacy, and of course economic and social development, our topic today. I think we'll all agree there's still a lot to be learned in these areas. These are areas that the social sciences long neglected. These are areas that our governments and international organizations don't fully grasp or necessarily even understand the need to more fully grasp going forward. But I think there's a sense through the work on this project and the work of many in this room, a sense that's emerging in the academy and among policymakers that whatever you think of religion, the religious factor is something that we need to understand better, that religious ideas, identities, and interests shape our world in all kinds of different ways. And of course, that's particularly true in the area of economic and social development, where commitments to social justice, commitments to the welfare of our fellow human beings are deeply rooted in religious values and ways of thinking and practices. And it's that intersection that we've been exploring under the leadership of Catherine Marshall. And I'd like you to join me in welcoming Catherine to the podium.
Thank you, Tom. And a very warm welcome to all of you. It's very exciting to see all of you in the flesh, so to speak, instead of just on emails at 5 o'clock in the morning. What I'm going to do now is to try to give you a little bit of a sense of what's going to happen today. In other words, the design of what it is that we're trying to do. And then we're going to move into the first panel where we'll actually get into it. But first, a couple of words on logistics. We have 3 panels here in Copley. And the themes basically are, first of all, the sort of geographic looks that we've taken at different regions of the world. The second will look at the set of issues, sort of HIV, corruption, gender, etc. We've done 8 reviews along those lines. And then the third is trying to set this more explicitly into the context of the Millennium Development Goals and the global efforts to improve the lives of the poorest people in the world. So that's the sort of design and structure. At lunch, Bishop Chain will be speaking. It'll probably be one of his last Washington appearances because his successor as Bishop of Washington is being installed on Saturday, and he is moving west. Says he's going to retire, but I don't believe it. But he is someone who has a passion for peace And as he said when I first met him, he has an absolute passion for development. So we're very pleased that, that Bishop Chain will be joining us at lunch. After the formal session closes, we want to do what has become sort of our hallmark, which is what we call a consultation, some brainstorming, you might call it, but a core group, and this is not exclusive, so if someone wants to come, they're welcome. We're going to go over to the Berkley Center and essentially try to probe an underlying question that we have, which is, so what next? In other words, where is it that this is going? What have we learned? I think Mark Juergensmeyer actually ends almost all of his meetings with his second grade teacher's comment or question, what did you learn today? So everyone has to go around and answer that question. But this is more the sort of so what next, the so what question of all of the extraordinary ideas and insights that we have gathered over a period of 5.5 years. So that's the structure. There are several people who can help you at any point that you need it. Michael Budakovsky, who's there, Melody Fox Ahmed, and Erin Coleman, who is over there. So they're sort of point people. We also have some of the staff of the World Faiths Development Dialogue, which includes Claudia Sambra and Hannah Friedrichi and Libby Bliss, and the famous Devin Coleman, who I'm sure most of you know is also here helping out. So that's on the logistics side. We have lots of documents. Actually, we've put out so far, I think, 27 reports that are both printed. They're all on the website. But I do want to point you to a draft report, which is the effort to distill what we have learned from this exercise. And it will be on the website today, I think, and it is there for comments. In other words, we welcome very much your feedback, and after we have that, we'll incorporate it and we'll put it out as sort of a summary report on the project. So that's the other thing that I would point you to, and there are a couple of documents, but there also are listings. One of the things, and we'll come back a little bit on this, that we have developed over the course of this project is a series of interviews, which are on the website. There are close to 200 of them. And the basic philosophy, and it's set out somewhere, is that a lot of the people who do the core development work really don't write. They don't like to write, or they don't have time. They're too busy doing other things. And so we've developed what we think for them is a fairly painless process where we talk for an hour plus, then we write it up and edit it, and they get to edit it, and it comes out. And for a lot of people, they say, you know, I never knew. I've never had someone actually hear what I said. So we think this is a gold mine of information, and we need to mine it. And that's one of our ideas of where we go next, is to do a more systematic analysis. But let's look a little bit at the landscape. A very important actor in this landscape is the Henry R. Luce Foundation, which decided, I think in 2005, where's Toby? Toby? She refused to be on a panel, but she's here anyway. Toby Volkman is the Luce person who deals with their initiative on religion and international affairs. And actually, David Little and I were on a committee well before Toby even dreamed that she would be doing this, that was helping the Luce Foundation to sort of think about what they were going to do. But I was counting this morning, there are well over 60 grants that the Luce Foundation has made to a variety of universities, to CSIS, to media, for conferences. They've really made an extraordinary contribution. And partly because of the early involvement and knowing something about the Luce process, we have a lot of Luce siblings here. So Jonathan van Antwerpen with the Social Science Research Council is one of them. Scott Appleby, I think, is a co-conspirator. Mark Juergensmeyer, Jose Casanova. A lot of people have been involved in one way or another in this rather extraordinary Luce effort. So we see this as very much within that context and have made as much effort as we could to try to understand what the other players in this are doing. So we have our cousins there, and some of them are here. Actually, Aza Karam is also a cousin. Second, this is something I personally am very much involved in because I came here from the World Bank and was drafted by Jim Wolfenson and George Carey to work on this project in 1999 and trying to bridge the gulfs with religion and development. If you look in the UN system and wanted to guess where there would be an initiative and insights on religion, I think the last institution you might look at would be the World Bank, and perhaps even more the IMF. But interestingly, both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have been leaders within the UN system, maybe because they have more independence and are able to navigate some of the shoals of politics. But in any event, the World Bank has been very much a partner in this, though I have to say that they have just closed the unit that deals with religion, development values, and so forth. There are three, then you have the World Faiths Development Dialogue, which Tom mentioned, which is an NGO. It's the brainchild of Jim Wolfenson and George Carey, but it is now a sort of robust little NGO that is sitting at the Berkley Center. And I'm heading it, so there's been a certain amount of symbiosis, and you will see WFDD mentioned in a lot of things. But I do want to mention three important parallel activities which will come up today. The first one is an intensive involvement in Cambodia over about a 4-year period. And that arose largely because we realized that this religion and development is too big and too abstract if you can't anchor it at the country level. And so we set out, and as we did with some other things, to do a sort of quick and dirty, a light look at what it would look like at a country level to say what are religious groups doing. 3 years later, we realized we're just scratching the surface. But there's a lot of work going on in Cambodia. The second is that the Tony Blair Faith Foundation has asked the World Faiths Development Dialogue to look at what is one of the most intensive areas of intersection, which is health. And so we have been doing a full review of what we know and what we don't know about religion and health. And Lynn Aylwood will be presenting some of that. And the third is that the United States Institute of Peace, USIP, has asked us to look at the ways in which women, religion, and peace go together. And so that brings us into what Scott Appleby will certainly be talking about, which is this whole question of peace building and our own reflection on how are peace building and development in any way different, or how are they related? In other words, it's how do we deal with that? So those are the three. I will mention very briefly, because I'm not even sure what to say about it, but the State Department has just launched a large initiative on religion and international affairs that does involve development, and a few of the people involved in that exercise, I think it's called a task force, will be here, but it's just started. It's part of looking to civil society, so the U.S. State Department is involved. I should also mention that there are a whole host of Georgetown initiatives which are related. The Woodstock Center is just about to come out with a project they've been working on for many years, which is looking at Jesuit perspectives on development, and from all over the world. There are major activities in health, starting with HIV/AIDS, but a health initiative. A lot of reflection on ethics and how ethics and development go together. That will be very much part of a new master's program in international development that's being launched next year. And then I should also mention that the Center for Reproductive Health, at the request of USAID, has been doing and has just come out with a report on how religion and family planning are related, and what are sort of the underlying views and also issues. The Berkley Center itself, this religion and global development has been quite a substantial part of the research, but it's also part of our teaching, and it relates very much to other parts of the Berkley Center's work, including religious freedom, looking also at conflict that all my colleagues are working on. I want to highlight 5 interviews, they're not available in hard copy, are they, for everyone? But they're certainly, 4 of them are on the website, and 1 will be, that we've actually undertaken for this. And one of them is the one that's not quite cleared yet. That's why we can show you, but we can't put it on the web, is with Carol Rakoti, who ran one of the most ambitious research programs on religion and development. It was financed by the British Development Agency, DFID, and undertaken by the University of Birmingham over a 5-year period. And it focused intensely on India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Tanzania. And they have come up with a massive production of documents and so forth. But Carol, who was the research director and ran this over the full period, in her interview reflects on the experience, on what they've learned. And I will just add as a footnote that one of the findings is that they submitted their final reports to DFID 6-7 months ago, and as yet they have had no reaction. So that is a reason for reflection. In other words, I think for us, it makes the challenge starker. How do we make all this work relevant for the people who are looking at development? Another interview with someone who could not be here is with Ian Linden, who is reflecting on another important experience, which is the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, which is also engaged in this. And Ed Scott, who supported CIFA, the Center for Interfaith Action on Global Poverty, has agreed to do an interview, but we haven't been able to pin him down yet. So that will be one that will be coming. The others that are, the people will be here. So Azza Karam probably knows more than anyone else about how the entire United Nations system has been dealing with these issues of religion. So from the vantage point of UNFPA, but she's also part of interagency task forces and a network. And Tom Jones from Habitat for Humanity was actually one of the first people who came to us asking us to launch an initiative at the Berkley Center. And so he has reflected on how that has affected the work that Habitat for Humanity has been doing on shelter. Did I get everybody on that? Oh, and Quentin Woden from the World Bank has also reflected on the World Bank experience. So I think that's sort of the landscape. In other words, a lot of different activities, a number of institutions trying to come to grips with this octopus of a field with so many different tentacles. And what we're trying to do today is to see really where we've come and what we've learned and where we should go next. So on to the first panel. And I see Andrew's here. I wanted to mention that we have 2 outstanding moderators who will be here. The first one is Andrew Natsios, who I think needs really no introduction because he has been doing so many different things with World Vision, with USAID, and with the university in many different capacities. And Sir Timothy Lancaster, who has also many roles at Oxford University, DFID. He was the UK Executive Director at the World Bank when I first met him. No, we met before then even, yes. Yes. But anyway, Tim came to this, interestingly, I think with some skepticism when he was asked to join the board of the World Faiths Development Dialogue, but we can almost say perhaps that he's become a convert. So, so in any event, that's our lineup for today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I really do appreciate Catherine's invitation to moderate this, but she also said I should make some opening remarks. I will attempt to limit, because I could speak the entire morning, as Catherine knows, without constraint, if I don't limit myself. Let me say first that I come from a very mixed tradition within Christianity. My wife is a very devout Catholic, as are two of my children. One of my children remains in the Protestant church, and I spent much of my life in the Congregational church and then the Presbyterian church, and I was at World Vision as a vice president for 5 years. And then I left and went back to the Orthodox church. So the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church in North America says, you have all three traditions in Christianity in the same household. Do you have civil wars? And I said, no, but there was mixed use of language in our household all the time, which is entertaining and interesting. It does encourage intolerance, however. So I've thought about this a lot since being at World Vision, and I have some perspectives on this. One, when I was at World Vision, I saw the role of the Christian church particularly, but Islam and Buddhism as well, and Judaism, as part of civil society. And there's so much literature on civil society. I'm not going to dwell on that, but the churches and the mosques and the synagogues and the Buddhist temple role in civil society cannot be underestimated. And in fact, it is the dominant indigenous civil society in many countries. But I'll let other people deal with that. I do want to focus more on the question of religious values and transformational development. And I always like to tell stories because even for scholars, stories people remember better than the more abstract comments. We had a big gender issue in World Vision because we made a decision, I shouldn't say we, World Vision made a decision, I'm not there anymore, to try to decolonize. I use that term advisedly because most of the great NGOs were run by Westerners who worked in the developing world and ran the national offices. And World Vision actually was the first major NGO to say this is not acceptable. And it was based on Scripture. You know, if you accept the Apostle Paul's in the epistles comment or writing that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, man nor woman, it suggests Christian universalism, which says that there is no distinction and between members or among members of the church. I mean, it was actually a radical statement if you think about it at the time. And what World Vision decided to do was to look at, and given it's an evangelical, or it had its roots in the evangelical church, it took Scripture as it was written very seriously. And so the admonitions toward gender equality in the New Testament and in the Old Testament were taken very seriously. And as we decolonize, which is to say we put Africans in charge of Africa and Latin Americans in charge of the Latin American offices, we never had we took out the Westerners who were running it. We raised the money basically, did program design in the West, but the actual implementation and policy making was done. And the majority of people on the World Vision International Board 20 years ago were not Americans or Canadians or Australians, the three biggest World Vision offices. They were from the South. And so when people say, it gets me angry actually when they say it, that World Vision is a North American evangelical fundamentalist, that's complete nonsense. That hasn't been true in 40 years. And people need to understand all NGOs are an evolution, but particularly World Vision was earlier than most other NGOs. And we had a project run by a Somali woman who was a convert. And she understood and studied scriptural traditions and did a whole course for the national offices. And this is not a criticism, it's just a statement of fact. There is a lot of patrimonialism in many developing countries around the question of gender. In Africa, many of the African men who ran the World Vision offices said women have a role, but it is certainly not equal to men. They would not say it that way, but the practice was very clear. We didn't have any women heads of any national offices, and eventually that changed. But when she went around to the offices to do the course training for all of the staff, there was resistance. And the way in which she convinced people to transform their view was based on Scripture. If you accept Scripture as the having the revealed truth of God in it, then you can't debate God. And so in a favorable way, I mean, Scripture can be used to force transformational change if there's a disparity between people's behavior and what the scriptural tradition is. And this was used, and some men in some World Vision offices in Africa who were Africans resigned. They were outraged by this insistence on this new gender policy, and there were really, people's faith were challenged by this. And so what happened, interestingly enough, is it did have a transformational effect on World Vision that was caused by the unique nature of religious civil society as opposed to secular civil society. If you say there's a UN doctrine on gender equality to a secular NGO, they'll take it, they'll bow their head and all that, but it may not be transformational in terms of the culture. If you accept as a given the authority of Scripture or of your, whatever your religious tradition is, and you show there's a disparity between what the tradition is and what your behavior is, then it does jar people. It does jar people. But it also has another effect, and I have to say this. You asked Catherine in her note to me, what's the downside of this? Well, it depends on your point of view. I personally am pro-life, and the Christian endorsement of the sanctity of life is not a new doctrine. I always find it entertaining when Westerners attack the Pope or the Patriarch of our church saying they are reactionary in this pursuit. They have nothing to do with it. It is Christian teaching from the first century. If you read the Didache from about 90 or 100 AD, it says in it, that's an earliest Christian doctrine on church doctrine teaching and ethics and church practice. It says you will not take the life of an unborn child. It's very clear in it. So this goes back 1900 years. The affirmation, however, in the Christian teaching of the sanctity of life is not just before a child is born, it's also after a child is born. And so the protection of human rights for a child after it's born has equal importance to the protection of life before birth. So you have to, and you can do the same thing in Islam or Buddhism or Judaism. There are certain things that modernity is pressing on the church which is not going to change. You are not going to change the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, or the Evangelical Church position on the sanctity of life. I can't imagine it happening. I know in my church it's never going to happen. So if you are really offended by that, you can see that as, I see that as an upside, but if you're on the other side of the debate, you see it as a downside. But it means that the development can be done within the context of tradition of the religious vision of the particular religious tradition we're talking about. Now let me make one last comment and then I'll sit down, and that is about development agencies. Because of the 18th century Enlightenment and the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights, we have this separation of church and state. And there is an aversion. I said whenever I travel in AID to the developing world, I want to see all the religious leaders from all the traditions. I have a very close friend who's a Buddhist monk from South Korea who is my ally on the North Korean famine. Whenever he comes here, he and I talk. We've had some very interesting, if you want to call it theological debates, they're theological on my side, but he says some of the reason we, the Buddhists and Christians, don't quite understand each other is the use of language, which is an intriguing way of approaching what I think are more fundamental views. But so wherever I would go, I would meet the Muslim leaders or the Jewish leaders, Christian leaders, and Buddhist leaders. And what I found is very interesting. There is a aversion because of the separation of church and state and development agencies in dealing with this. Catherine dealt with this in the World Bank. It exists in the UN system, and it exists in AID, and particularly even more aggressively in Western Europe, where the church is in a different position than it is in the United States. But what I found was people of faith in AID had suppressed their private commitments because they believed it was somehow antithetical to their public duties. I found out a large number of people in the agency were devout Muslims or Jews or Christians, and that when it was now acceptable to discuss these things, I said, well, you can't tell me that it doesn't have effect on how you view things. He said, well, it does, Andrew. We can't discuss it because it's a violation of the church and state. Asking people of faith to suppress their ethics when they're in the public sector, it causes tensions. Anyway, this is my final story, is I went to a country in Africa where there was a war raging. There are three religious traditions. The biggest war was between the evangelicals and the Anglicans, believe it or not. The Muslims were the mediators in this particular, and I had the ambassador have a meeting of the religious leaders. They had never met in the same room before. I was shocked, actually, in this country. I don't want to mention the country. It's well known. It's not an obscure country. The ambassador said, "Why do you want to have this meeting?" I said, "Because there are issues here only the church and the mosque can deal with, and I think by cooperating with each other, it might improve it." And he said, "I'm doing it, but under duress." He did it. When he finished the lunch, he said, "I'm going to do this all the time. This was great." He said, "I thought the fight was going to be between the Muslims and the Christians. The fight was between the Anglicans and the Catholics and the evangelicals and Pentecostals." And we dealt with the ravages of the AIDS pandemic and what it was doing to society at the village level for all of them, and what they were facing as challenges and how they were dealing with it. And that's what came out as an area of potential cooperation, which I found quite interesting and very fascinating. Anyway, let me sit down now. So our next speaker, I'm not going to read the bios because they're they're so long it'll take the entire hour and a half to read their bios. Mark Jurensmeyer, is that how you say it? Is going to speak next on the challenges of definition, knowledge, and controversy.
I think I'm first.
Oh, you're first. I'm sorry, Catherine, you are first.
Sorry, you forgot me. Sorry, Mark. I think I will speak from here. You've just heard quite a bit from me, but what I'm hoping to do in this intervention, and please tell me when I get to 10 minutes, is essentially to set out some of the basic framework, which is why I suggest that I do go first, of what it is that we've tried to do with a 5.5-year research project that has been supported by the 2 Luce Foundation grants and also by the supporters of the World Faiths Development Dialogue. So what did we set out to do? But we use the word mapping a lot. And of course, what I'm going to try to do is to give you essentially a map of our research landscape. But let me talk about this word mapping first. There's a certain amount of tension about what it really means, because now we have GIS mapping where you can sort of pinpoint every single institution or building in the world, and that is very useful in some settings. In other words, if you're trying to do a malaria program and you want to know where the clinics are, it's very important to have that, to use those tools. But what we're talking about is more what I call a journalist's mapping, looking at the basic questions journalists are taught to ask, sort of who, where, what, why, when, with how much, to what ends, et cetera. It's a basic effort to understand what I sometimes describe as the galaxy of institutions, and we're focusing on institutions that are in some way linked to religion or faith. So that's what we mean by mapping. It's our first effort to understand, and in many parts of the world, even after this 5.5 years, we have the broadest landscape, the broadest map of understanding of what is happening. Because every time we look, we find more. But let me also comment. Andrew was mentioning something that's very important, which is the wrestling with terminology. And every group that is working on these issues wrestles with terminology. It's quite interesting, I think, that the DFID project started out calling itself Faiths and Development for the same reason that the World Faiths Development Dialogue uses the word faith. And that was essentially on the understanding that this was more acceptable to and encompassing for the Vedic traditions, the non-Abrahamic faiths. And yet, there are many among those traditions who don't like the use of the word faith because to them it implies a certain approach to belief. So I think we've come to feel that there's no ready answer to that one, but it does call for a lot of sensitivity. We've come to use the term faith-inspired as opposed to faith-based, and that has quite a specific history. And Patrice will be talking a bit about how we worked in the Muslim world, across, of course, many different continents, but we found a great discomfort in terming something faith-based. And To me, the classic example, and in a sense test, was that the Aga Khan Development Network, which is one of the most extraordinary actors in this, will not accept that they are faith-based, but they do accept that they are faith-inspired. And the same is true of a large number of community organizations. So faith-inspired is designed to suggest less explicit institutional links, but also a broader definition of inspiration. Of course, that can open a lot of doors because many institutions started with a religious foundation, and the Red Cross is among those, but now would say clearly that they are not related to religion in any way. But in any event, what we're trying to capture is the broader set of institutions. I also need to comment that development is a very difficult term. I came to understand that in a university, development has a special meaning, which is fundraising, which is not at all what we're talking about. But international development, perhaps 40, 50 years ago, was fairly clear what people were talking about. There were a certain set of institutions, it was about progress, there were academic departments, et cetera. But over time, that has become much less clear. And with climate change and post-conflict, et cetera, development actually means pretty much everything because it is about change. So the development field is very amorphous, and it's not easy to decide. So you have to decide in each situation what you're talking about, and one of our questions is often, what do you mean and understand by development? Which brings me to another point, which I'm going to cite one of my favorite commentators, a Swedish public health specialist called Hans Rosling, who has brilliant summaries of data. But one of his comments is that he has a friend who is a world wine expert, who knows every single kind of wine in the world. Red, Rieslings, et cetera. But he, Hans Rosling, only knows two, which is red and white. But he says his neighbor knows only two kinds of countries, developed and developing, whereas he knows more than 200, with each one of them with their distinct trajectory. And I think this is a very important, constant theme in our work, which is that it is about diversity. So one of our conclusions, it's very complicated, and we've barely begun to scratch the surface. I'm going to put out again what I mentioned before, Ian Linden's challenge, which I think is the challenge for us, that perhaps the reason why DFID has not in any way responded to this extraordinary body of research, which was done for them, is that it didn't come up with startling enough recommendations. It didn't come up with some very specific actions. I think our sense is that there aren't any really, that talking about dividing the world into religion and non-religion is a nonsense. But what we are facing is a history, a 60-year history at least, of blinders that have prevented people from seeing major actors, approaches, and issues. And our hypothesis is that if we understand them, we will be in a much better position to improve the quality of development assistance. So that is the challenge and what we hope. Very briefly, we did 3 sets of activities specifically in the context of the Luce project. The first, actually we set out in the beginning, and Tom Banshoff, I think, assigned me this project as I first sort of blundered into Georgetown. We were going to do 2 meetings and take care of the whole world. We were going to do one on the US, and then we were going to do one in Doha, which was sort of the rest. But we quickly realized that this was not going to work. And over time, we did 6 regional reviews, each of which involved background research, mostly by students, but also by colleagues, other colleagues, that have essentially tried to figure out what's known, what's on the web, what's not, what's the academic literature. And then we had what we called a consultation, which was a very lively meeting where we said, okay, what's going on and what are the issues? And a few people who participated in those consultations are here. We have published reports on each of the regional meetings and the background papers, which we've tried to make them interesting. So again, we know we're just scratching the surface, a huge amount of research to be done in order to understand, even at one country level, what it is that this variety of institutions are doing. One of the things we've heard everywhere is that people want networks. They want to have better networks. But asking them what those networks would look like is very difficult, because most people don't want more emails. And they don't necessarily want more to read. They don't want networks that are thousands. They want them very targeted, and that's very difficult to do. So I think that is one of them. The second thing that we did, so this is the 6 regions, we also have looked at 8 among the many development issues. And this started, in a sense, with 2 particular perspectives. The first was HIV/AIDS, which I think is a historic change and development that's taken place, that started with religion being clearly viewed as the problem that created stigma and so forth. But it has led to an extraordinary number of institutions that are now totally part of the the Global AIDS campaign. So we set out to do that. I would comment that we found that first one almost shocking in the tensions that underlie that issue. It's not easy. There's a lot of unease around the HIV/AIDS issue, even though there's been a lot of progress. And the second theme that we started to look at was corruption. And there, what was striking was that even though many of the leading figures in fighting corruption in the world have a religious root, whether it's Cardinal Oscar, what's his name? Nicaragua. I'm dropping his name, but anyway. Salvador. Romero.
Yeah.
And others. If you actually go to meetings, as I have, of Transparency International or the International Anti-Corruption Conference, there are no callers. No religious people involved. And so we set out to try to understand why it is that so few religious leaders are part of the global anti-corruption effort, even though, at least in theory, they belong there. So those were 2. The third issue that comes back to what development is about is that there is a very important paradigm shift in the development community, which instead of focusing on developed and underdeveloped or third world, which no one knows what it means anymore, focuses increasingly on the failed states. In other words, on the bottom billion, bottom 500 million, the groups of people who are left behind. And of course, our hypothesis is that in those areas, often the only services are provided by religious institutions, and yet, in the development community discourse about failed states, religion is completely absent. And that seems to be a crying need. So that, I think, was another area that we've sort of come to as we've progressed. Finally, just very, very briefly, looking at the MDG framework and the whole sort of that came out of the United Nations meeting in the year 2000 with a 15-year timeline and deadlines and targets, we find that every single one of the 8 targets, goals, and the many targets, you can see a religious imprint and a religious approach, but it's not been looked at systematically in any way. And that is, in a sense, what we're doing as we reflect, because these are the global goals. They map onto every one. So our questions are, how far are the activities that so many of these groups doing part of strategies, and how far are they basically doing their thing on their own? And of course, it's a huge mix. We had an interesting discussion on South Sudan a few weeks ago, where there was actually quite a lively disagreement between my partner to the right, Andrew Natsios, and somebody from the World Bank, with the World Bank director essentially saying, for South Sudan to succeed, it simply must pull together the multitude of actors, and the government must chart the course through a strategy. And Andrew, who I will take the liberty of quoting, said, do you think the United States, when it became independent, had a strategic framework or a poverty reduction strategy paper that, you know, the process of things sort of evolving with local initiative is better? And this is a sharp divide within the development community between those who think that the system is total chaos and that there needs to be some order. There's a big meeting taking place in Busan, Korea, this month, which is dealing with aid harmonization. And another view, which many religious groups are sort of in that camp, that, you know, just let us work at the community level and do what we can with what we've got, rather than trying to fit into a strategy. So I think this is one of the issues. So the coordination issue is one that's come out in every single part of the world and every issue. Another one is what is distinctive about faith? We've come to say that faith, we're looking for things that are distinctive but not unique. Whenever I see the word unique, I cut it out, because I think that is problematic. But what difference does religion make? Are there ways that you can generalize? And are there ways that we can address the biases that color the views of the secular organizations, which make them close their minds and their doors when the word religion is mentioned? And just to end with the two hottest issues that come up again and again, the first one is gender and patriarchy, and the second one is proselytizing and evangelizing. And behind that, a concern with what is the motive. In other words, are people running hospitals doing it because they care for the poor and the sick, or are they doing it because they think that through that process they will gain converts for all of the reasons that they would wish to do so? Thank you.
I think I'm going to stand up. Thank you, Catherine. I think I'm going to stand up just so everybody can see me. I can see all of you. And, you know, I'm used to lecturing to large groups of undergraduates, and this is a way we make sure people don't fall asleep. And so I'm going to be checking on you. I know who you are. I saw you nodding when Catherine was speaking. I'm going to call off you if you try to sleep during my remarks. Well, the assignment of this panel is on issues of definition, and reading over the reports from the wonderful project that Catherine has been involved in. I see a resonance in two of the Luce supported projects that I've been involved in. And of course you would know that I would seize the opportunity of the little time that I have to talk about those projects and the way in which they've interfaced with the project, the wonderful project that Catherine is involved in here at the Berkley Center. These two projects are both a part of the Luce Initiative on Religion and International Affairs. One is a project with the Social Science Research Foundation, Research Council, to look at some of the intellectual issues with regard to religion and international affairs, a wonderful working group that I was privileged to be a part of. And the other one was a companion project to this one, based in Santa Barbara, on the role of religion in global civil society. It may sound like a similar project to the project that Catherine has been involved in the Berkley Center, but whereas you've been focusing on faith-based organizations, NGOs, we've also looked at NGOs, but within the context of the wider role of civil society and the role of the changing role of religion in different parts of the world that affect non-faith-based NGOs, human rights activists, relief organizations, UN-based groups, as well as faith-based groups. That's the difference between our two projects. But you can see that the issues have been the same. Catherine has been at almost all of our workshops. I feel like you're a part of the leadership team of the Santa Barbara project, and we've tried very hard to coordinate our two activities so that we support what the Berkley Center is doing, they support what we're doing, and we're not in competition. But first, let me say something about the SSRC project. This was a terrific thing. Lou said to Craig Calhoun, the president of the SSRC, put together a bunch of people who can think about the changing role of religion and the way it impacts on international affairs. He contacted me and with the staff member Jonathan Van Antwerpen, who became our right-hand man and partner in the project. The three of us put together a dream team of working group, and to our delightful surprise, they all agreed. Charles Taylor, Talal Assad, Jose Casanova, who's here, Scott Appleby, who's here, Saba Mahmood, a wonderful group of people. And we've just completed our work in a book called Rethinking Secularism. And if I were the promoter that Jonathan is, I would have a copy of that book in my hand and forms for you to fill out so you could order it. Where's Jonathan? You're here someplace, I know. Jonathan, do you have copies of this book in your hand? Oh, you've disappointed me. But we have a friendly website. Oxford University Press has just published the book. We're going to have a launching at the American Academy of Religion meetings in San Francisco in a couple weeks. And it's the product of several years of intense discussion. It's like the best graduate seminar I've ever been a part of, where we've read each other's papers, we've talked about the whole thing. And what we decided to focus on was not so much the role of religion, but the counterpart to religion, that twin ideological concept of secularism, which, as we increasingly think about the role of religion in public life, it threatens our Western post-Enlightenment notion of what secularism is in public life. And that was the project, and we encourage you to look at the Rethinking Secularism book for a product of our conversation. We started the project shortly after Charles Taylor published his monumental A Secular Age, so a lot of our thinking was initially informed by that. The website, The Immanent Frame, which actually comes from a phrase of Taylor's, that we live in an immanent frame in a world of secularism, comes out of that initial stages of the project and has taken on a wonderful life of its own under Jonathan's masterful direction. I know a lot of you already follow The Immanent Frame on your website, and I encourage you to continue doing so. But the whole question of what secularism is, and what religion is a problem for all of us, not just the two projects that Catherine and I are a part of. We like to think everybody knows what it is when we use those terms, but everybody doesn't know what it is when we use those two terms. This problem was brought about to me in a very dramatic fashion when I was first a graduate student, when I went to India, working on a project of the religion and political movements of untouchables in rural Punjab in northern India. And as a social scientist, I was armed with a questionnaire. I had created a 60-question questionnaire, beautifully presented, worked out, every question in detail with multiple choice answers. I was going to get a statistical response. I had a group of graduate students at Punjab University who were going to help me go out and talk with untouchables throughout the region and try to get answers to these questions. Well, got to tell you that I had trouble with question number one, and the whole thing just fell apart with question number two. Question number one was, what is your name? Sounds sensible, but untouchables in northern India have different names for different purposes. They have religious names, they have village names, they have kind of occupational names, and religious names relating to Sikhism, relating to Hinduism. What name did I want? The untouchables would cower on the floor, afraid to sit on a chair because my graduate interpreter was in fact the son of the headman in the village. And of course they wanted to be respectful. What is it that I wanted? Well, let's move on to question number two. What is your religion? My graduate student interpreter paused and turned to me and he said, what do you mean? I said, religion. He said, well, what word do you want me to use? Do you want me to say calm for a large religious community like Islam or Hinduism? You want me to say dharma, meaning your basic beliefs of law and natural order? Do you want me to say mazhab, which is a more prescribed list of beliefs? Do you want me to use pant, which means a kind of fellowship of believers? What is it that you want me to use? I said, well, all of those. He said, we don't have a term for all of those. We have different terms for different kinds of activity and belief and ascription, but we don't have a term like religion. So what do you do with cultures that don't have terms like religion? And we know even in the West that the idea, the manufacture of the word religion is a relatively recent invention in Western history. So what is it that we mean by religion? And do we mean, when we're concerned about the role of religion in international affairs, are we talking about social identity? Are we talking about institutionalization? Are we talking about ideology? Are all of those? What if we didn't have the term religion? What would we use? What if we didn't have the term secularism? What would we be talking about when we're trying to talk about a kind of modern ideological post-Enlightenment sentiment in public life? So these are the questions that resonated through the SSRC project, but also through Catherine's project and also through our project at Santa Barbara. Where at Santa Barbara, we looked at the role of religion and global civil society, focusing on three large questions. The role of religion and its different ways of thinking about it and different manifestations in contemporary social change. The way this limits or alters the role of international NGOs, and thirdly, the kind of response that international NGOs will take to the situation. We have a series we also have reports, and I have multiple copies of those on the table in the back. We've tried to present reports of our workshops in kind of nonlinear fashion, little excerpts of comments that respond to these questions rather than long didactic essays. And a lot of our focus, the product of our project, will be in short video clips that will be available for teaching purposes on our website. We've focused on three areas of the world, the Latin America, the Middle East, and South Asia. And most recently in Cairo. About 6 weeks ago, we were in Cairo at a meeting at the AUC campuses in the center of Cairo, right next to Tahrir Square. And as luck would have it, we were there on the weekend of the largest protest in Tahrir Square since January 25th. So about 100,000 people flooded the Tahrir Square. We had a sense of what it was like, what that extraordinary moment of transformation and change was like for the people who participated in the January Revolution. And the people who were involved in our workshop were activists, cops, feminists, socialists, people from religious communities, speaking to different dimensions of change that are part of this remarkable transformation in Egypt. And one of the things we discovered is that when you're talking about the role of religion in whatever way you want to conceive of that term, it's a multifaceted thing. Of course, we think of the Salafi attempt to try to, it says, hijack the revolution and make it into an Islamic revolution. But that's only one part of the story. There's a large Sufi, Sunni Islamic community within Egypt. And the tensions between the Salafis and Sufis are considerable. And then on the third side, there's the institutional structure. The Grand Mufti of Cairo, with whom we talked, was very concerned about both of these elements because the institutional imam clergy of Cairo is very concerned about both the politicization of Islam and the non-institutionalization of it in community-based groups. And then, of course, there are Coptic Christians who feel buffeted by all of these winds of changes. So the role of religion, even in an institutional setting, is quite diverse. If there's one single answer to our first question of the way in which religion is changing in public life, I would say in all these cases there's increasing institutionalization and ideologization of religion, attempt to try to rigidify religion as an identity, as a set of ideological beliefs, and as an institutional structure in different parts of the world. It's a disturbing trend, and yet it's not a successful one in that there are competing ideologies, competing institutions. And so the claim of any particular group over the kind of religious landscape is not complete. And the answers to the second and third questions, the role of the NGOs, is again diverse, finding opportunity in this change in many cases, at the same time that they feel limited by it. I think of one of the AIDS activists in Latin America who, under the constraints of the Roman Catholic Church, in his efforts to try to bring education that he thinks will help to control the spread of the disease, found elements within the church that were really very supportive. And he found that simply to counter the church was not a very productive way to marshal the potential support within the church for at least some aspects of AIDS education within the rural areas of northern Argentina where he was trying to work, and that there were possibilities for cooperation as well as competition in this very important area. So, Catherine, we have discovered, like you, that the role of religion in global civil society is a complicated and diverse thing, but also one that in its transformation offers a number of opportunities for groups to develop and prosper and to be a part of what is an emerging global civil society of the future. Thank you.
Now we'll hear from Patrice Brodeur.
Good morning, everybody, and I'll speak from here. And I just want to first start by congratulating Catherine Marshall and all of her team, both here and abroad, for the amazing work that has come out of this research project over the last few years. I think that that's a beginning point which is very important to me, because I know that this kind of research is not easy to achieve. It requires a lot of patience and flexibility, and so I'd like to just congratulate you, Catherine, for doing that, pulling it off, as we would say. I had three questions basically to address. One was thinking about charity and Muslim philanthropy and Muslim development work, and which was the focus which brought me into the project initially. When the first question was asked, well, what kinds of actors are there and what comes out of it? I first want to, of course, point out to two of the reports here which are related directly to that effort of focusing our attention for this project on the Muslim world. And of course, I could say that there is no equivalent to the Christian world or the Hindu world or the Buddhist world, so in and of itself, sort of that might be part of my last suggestion in terms of next steps, that maybe a comparative sort of analysis at that level might be interesting eventually. But when looking at the Muslim actors in the field of development, I think that the obvious word, as was mentioned before in the introduction, is diversity. But let me be a little more specific about what kind of diversity. Of course, we can think of identity dynamics, and we talk about cultural, linguistic diversity, that's fine. But maybe more importantly to me is hermeneutical diversity, which is how do Muslim actors go about interpreting their links to the Quran and the whole institutions of Islam to which they want to belong in one way or another. As we use the word faith-inspired, and we want to think of, well, what does that look like from within an Islamic discourse? Well, there is no one Islamic discourse. There's a plurality of discourses by Muslims about an Islamic discourse, what ought to be that sort of key sort of central Islamic discourse about reality. And so that hermeneutical diversity is very important to recognize from the outset, and it of course has a direct implication on who to invite to different kinds of activities on the ground. and therefore seeking as a person, both from within the tradition or from without, to seek to have as much diversity as possible on the ground in developing the projects and doing the research and the analysis is really like an obvious thing to say, but sometimes the obvious needs to be stated. Then a second dimension, which is not the same as the first, is what I would call ideological diversity. And that's more specifically linked to different kinds of political discourses. And here, for example, we can sort of simply think about the notion of democracy, which the vast majority of Muslims are going to accept, but not necessarily equating it to secularism. That democracy does not come hand in hand with secularism, obviously, because for most Muslims, Islam is not in conflict necessarily with the state and so on and so forth. At least, again, this is where the ideological diversity will come in. Some will say yes, some will say no, and so on and so forth. Fine. Then there's another element of diversity, which is the diversity of networks. When we say network, what do we mean by network? And there are very traditional kinds of networks that have existed for centuries. In any religious tradition, of course, that's the same. And when we don't sort of know enough about the history of how a religious tradition has self-organized and developed over time, we may be missing out on some of these kinds of networks, which are not the obvious ones to match our Western history. In particular, in terms of institutions linked to nation state. And here I'm going to sort of focus on one kind of network which would be called sort of the mystical orders of the tariqas, and the way in which they are transnational, the way they are very old. They have different degrees of transformation in relationship to modernity and modern issues, but they are actors on the ground in different ways, and that is very important. And I haven't seen any traces really in the reports of these kinds of actors in the field, so that is for further research. And so ultimately, and the last sort of, and I could go on with other sort of identity factors, but the last one I want to sort of pinpoint, because it's again an obvious one, but it's age. Is the the age generational differences. And we know that for most majority Muslim countries, the average, the majority of the population is below 25 years old in I think probably most, if not all majority Muslim countries. And so the ways in which we relate to young people and the way in which they are excluded or included in a variety of projects, including research, is to me also an important question to raise. And I think some efforts were done here to at least sort of mention youth and look for a variety of different Muslim youth actors, but much, much more needs to happen in that regard. And clearly, I think the example of the Arab Spring, with its leaderless or formless kind of youth impact in society for calling for democracy and so on and so forth, is a clear example of the way in which that single identity marker of age, I think, is an important one to raise and to be conscious about and take into consideration seriously as it develops and impacts. And here the impact is also on how Muslim youth end up sort of having an impact internationally on other young folks worldwide. The second question that I was asked to talk about is, well, what are some of the strengths and what are some of the weaknesses of the project? And from, of course, my specific angle on the question of the Muslim world. Well, first of all, there are strengths, and I think that the distinction that initially Sa'd-ed-Din Ibrahim, a sociologist from Egypt, called for, which is not to talk about the Islamic world, but talk about the Muslim world and talk about Muslim institutions instead of Islamic institutions. The shift from Islamic to Muslim, I think, has been well noted and taken into account, and so throughout the paperwork that came out of the research and of the consultation in Qatar. The second is what I would call a very profound respect for Islamic language about development issues. And the way in which we better understand, and in one of the second 2008 Inspired by Faith report, the way in which there's a section that describes well, what is zakat, what is the waqf and the pious foundations, and how do they work, and and so on and so forth. So learning to understand from within sort of what are the key concepts that we need to work with as we develop links with Muslim organizations, I think is a plus. A third one is the broad geographical spread. I think the examples that were done dealt with not only state, i.e. majority Muslim state institutions, but also local NGOs, and so as well as transnational ones. And so there was a broad geographical and sociological or category kind of approach to doing that. And so for all these reasons, I think that there was the issue or the aim of mapping that diversity comes out very clearly in a very wonderful way. It's a very, very good beginning. Now, if we look at the weaknesses, then the question of equality versus equity, which we normally tend to address or to think of in terms of gender dynamic, and in the reports, that is clearly mentioned in a very strong way, that equity may be a better sort of concepts to work with when dealing with gender dynamics in Islam than equality per se coming out of a particular or secular kind of Western background. But I would prolong that sort of use of the word equity to also notions of religion versus civil society. Because we tend to think more and more that, well, religion are just part of civil society. And there's an assumption often that therefore they're NGOs, they're non-governmental organizations, right? But clearly the history of the way in which the communities understand themselves vis-a-vis this concept, this modern concept of the NGO, is something which is a bit of a tension, I would say, to be nice, if not a conflict in of itself. I can think of the Catholic Church, for example, that has problems when people would simply say, oh, well, that's a Catholic organization, therefore it's an NGO. It's not quite so simple, and the same exists, of course, in the Muslim world, especially in majority Muslim areas. And Muslim majority areas meaning within nation-state frameworks, because the nation-states, of course, love to be able to bureaucratize and eventually have some control over organizations, thereby sort of transforming more traditional kinds of organizations into ones that are charity-based with numbers that can actually be monitored and so on and so forth in ways that actually make it a little easier to understand what they're doing, or at least put maybe some pressure onto how and why they do and how they go about doing what they're doing. But this question of equity, to me, in understanding what exactly is the relationship between religious, the self-understanding of a religious community and its notion of the notion of civil society as a modern nation-state-based concept is something also that needs to be better understood and eventually sort of studied. I'd like to mention, secondly, that 5 different interdependencies are actually going to be useful to work towards in the next stage of this project, hopefully. And because when we focus on gender, the tendency is to really look at women's organization. And the question is, well, where are the men in this kind of dynamic? And so the interdependency between men and women, as we look at issues of disparities often between men and women, is something that I'd like to sort of think about as a concept, interdependency of gender. Also, interdependency of generation. We can focus on youth, yes, fine, but where are the youth within sort of the dynamics of the intergenerational dynamics of development institutions, and whether religious or otherwise working with religious people? So that interdependency of generation, is the second one. A third one is what I call interdependency on the local level. And here I play on the local and the global, and the interdependency of those two dynamics. That's a little more complicated and difficult maybe to pinpoint. But the need for international organizations or transnational organizations to be rooted in local initiatives, and how do the locals respond to those is a dynamic that I think is also ultimately one which is best rooted in notions of interdependency rather than codependency or dependency, straightforward. And when it comes to funding, I think that's a very important issue to look into. And the fifth interdependency is the donor-receiver dynamic, which I don't have much time to go into, but that was not really raised, but I think needs further exploration. And a last sort of dimension, I would say, of that needs to be explored further is the dynamic between rights and responsibilities. And I'll give here a personal example. I was hired by the Global Network of Religions for Children in order to do a research piece with 12 academics from 6 different religious and spiritual communities. And this is an international sort of NGO based in Japan, funding sort of issues through religious communities' involvement traditionally with children issues. And the link was with UNICEF, and the idea was to try to see how the UNICEF or the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child, how does that link to the faith communities, knowing how many faith communities are involved in education. And given that education is an important piece of development, then that's how it relates to this particular project. And after doing all of the research over 2 years, it was very, very frustrating not to have, in fact, the possibility of publishing with UNICEF any of the findings. And my assumption or my thought is probably because for all of the religious traditions, the emphasis from their faith perspective was not on rights, it was on responsibilities. It was about teaching children responsibilities that they have to live up to as a person of X, Y, or Z religious or spiritual worldview. And that somehow went against, I think, sort of a particular approach in the West or in the international community as well, to notions of rights often over responsibilities, or at least implicitly so. And so that, I think, is an interesting sort of issue to look at maybe, which is how do religious communities, and in my case, sort of Muslim communities, sort of think about notions of responsibilities vis-a-vis those of rights as developed and transmitted through the international community. Finally, the third question I was asked to respond to is next steps. On the research level, I think that, of course, the further mapping of what is really the tip of the iceberg is called upon in general terms. But I would like to sort of come back to notions of traditional networks here that often are not so easily accessed and researched. And here the help of anthropologists on the ground may be useful also. And I'm thinking about not only the mystical orders that Tariq has for the Muslim world, but also a lot of variety of mosque-based kinds of networks, often segregated along gender lines. And that's fine, but we just need to have in our research community enough women to be able to carry out the research in the projects, to be able to have access to that information. The issue of youth also is important, and how to access youth in terms of research if we don't work with students that tend to be younger in age than myself. And that, I think, is also another element that brings me to that I'll come back to in a few seconds. The issue of fear. What are the blockages that are actually impinging on possibilities of cooperation across different lines of institutional funding, as well as active collaboration on the ground? That issue, I think, maybe needs further research, and especially not just the fears, we kind of know them, but it's what are the mechanisms by which you trigger them off, or that's not the right word. How do you change the fear into a possibility of trust in the field? That, I think, is important. When I turn now to notions of policy action, there's three main issues that I'd like to end my contribution on. The first one is what I would call for is inter-university research dynamics. So that and here, when it comes to the Muslim world, that it's not just done from a university based in the US, in Georgetown, but that there's some parity in the funding of a research project, so that there can actually be some financial benefits to Muslim majority based institutions, so that there can actually be a sense of parity, which answers in part, I think, the fear issue initially mentioned. The second one has to do with how do we balance the meetings which tend to be interfaith or inter-worldview, and those that need to be intra-faith. so as to develop sort of understandings from within the communities where the whole effort is really an intra-faith dynamic, because I do think that the results are not quite the same in the long term. And the third and final point, which I think has policy relevancy, which is how do we promote joint secular religious funding for these kinds of efforts, so that when we describe and approach people to cooperate with the research and with the activities on the ground, there's a sense in which they recognize names, they recognize sort of some of the sources of the funding, and is particularly important given sort of the politics which is attached often in a post-9/11 world to sources of funding that come from the United States and more largely Western countries when it comes to trying to understand and analyze the so-called Muslim world, which is now really worldwide. Thank you.
And now we will hear from Elias Siznicki. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation, and not only for this invitation, for a lot of invitation from Catherine on the last year to participate in a lot of events linked to this program. I'm sorry for you, but I like more to speak in Spanish. My English is not the best, and thank you in advance to Claudia. She will translate me to English. Catherine, cuando nos envió la invitación, nos pedía que pensemos acerca acerca de lo que sabemos hoy un poco más, luego de estos años de trabajo conjunto, de investigación conjunta.
When Catherine sent the invitation initially, she asked participants to think about what knowledge we've gained since we began this exercise.
Y teniendo siempre presente que la herramienta fundamental con la cual trabajamos fue el mapeo de las organizaciones basadas en la fe.
Bearing in mind that the toolkit for this exercise would be mapping, in the sense that Catherine previously explained.
Yo creo que luego de haber trabajado estos años desde Religiones por la Paz y también junto con Catherine, junto con Quentin, que está en la audiencia del Banco Mundial, podemos pensar que cuando hablamos de los problemas que hacemos referencia hoy en América Latina, más que hablar sobre trabajo en contra de la pobreza, lo que estamos hablando es cómo trabajar para devolver la dignidad a las personas.
So after all these years working with WCRP and also with Catherine and with Quentin and the World Bank, in Latin America, when we think about this, the problem is more about
¿Cómo devolver la dignidad a las personas?
yes, how to return dignity to people in Latin America. That's one of the questions that they're essentially looking at.
Y fundamentalmente el tema de devolver la dignidad a las personas está relacionado con el grave problema de la desigualdad que tenemos en la región.
And when we think about returning dignity to people, we have to think about the obvious issue of inequality in Latin America.
Más que pobreza en América Latina, tenemos una gran desigualdad, y la desigualdad es fundamentalmente el resultado de una profunda discriminación que siempre ha habido en América Latina y el Caribe. Nuestras sociedades nacieron como sociedades formadas desde la discriminación, y esa discriminación no ha desaparecido completamente luego de 200 años de independencia.
When we think about inequality, it's not just about poverty, but it's also about discrimination. And in Latin America, many of these societies were formed on the basis of discrimination even 200 years ago during the colonial era.
Y especialmente vemos la discriminación que viene por razones de género, por casta, por etnia, diferentes tipos de discriminación que no hemos logrado superar en América Latina y que son la verdadera causa de la desigualdad y, por supuesto, también de la pobreza.
And when we talk about discrimination, there are many forms of discrimination. So gender would be one, caste, ethnic discrimination. These are all things that sort of pervade attitudes in Latin America.
Catherine también nos preguntaba cómo diferenciamos entre grupo de fe y grupo de fe con respecto al tema del desarrollo en América Latina.
Catherine, one of the questions she asked us to look at was how do we differentiate between faith-based organizations in Latin America? How do we distinguish them?
Y podemos ver que en el caso de la Iglesia Católica, que como ustedes saben es nuestro componente religioso ampliamente mayoritario, existen grandes tensiones internas y muchos sectores enfrentados dentro de ella.
And in Latin America, the Catholic Church is clearly the largest player in the religious community. And even within the church, there are many different tensions.
No es solamente la tensión tradicional que todos conocemos entre progresistas y conservadores, sino incluso son tensiones mucho más acerca de lo que es la naturaleza de la Iglesia en nuestros días.
And there are tensions that go beyond the sort of traditional liberal and conservative, but also just on other issues within the church.
Cuando uno se reúne, participa, trabaja con las personas de la Iglesia Católica que trabajan en temas de pastoral social, uno encuentra que es un discurso completamente diferente al del liderazgo oficial de la Iglesia Católica.
When you actually meet with people from the Catholic Church on social issues, you find that the conversations go far beyond the hierarchical issues.
Y parecería como que hablaríamos de dos mundos completamente diferentes.
And you would think that you're speaking about two different worlds entirely.
Un ejemplo concreto es, por ejemplo, el problema de la minería, que es un problema muy grave en América Latina.
One example is on mining, which is a very big problem in Latin America.
Vemos como, por ejemplo, la gente que trabaja en la pastoral social trata de luchar para limitar la minería en América Latina, mientras que los obispos, los cardenales, muchas veces dicen nosotros no tenemos que meternos en esos temas porque no le corresponde a la Iglesia hablar sobre eso.
So, for example, on this issue, you have sort of the bottom echelon, shall we say, of the church who are fighting against all these issues of mining, and then you have sort of the higher part of the hierarchy, so the bishops saying that this is not really something that they should become involved in. It's really none of their business, shall we say.
Vemos, por ejemplo, que las iglesias protestantes cada vez son más pequeñas en América Latina. Me refiero a las iglesias protestantes liberales, históricas, pero sin embargo ellas sienten que pese a que son cada vez menos numerosas y menos importantes, tienen un mensaje particular que deben continuar transmitiendo, pese a la poca audiencia que ellas mismas tienen.
So the Protestant churches, which are in Latin America, which are traditionally thought of as more liberal, although they are becoming smaller and smaller in number throughout the continent, they still feel that they have a special place there and a special message to convey.
Creo que algo igual pasa aquí en los Estados Unidos. En el caso de las comunidades judías vemos una clara superioridad de los laicos sobre los rabinos, por ejemplo, a diferencia de lo que ocurre aquí en los Estados Unidos.
In the Jewish community, there appears to be a clear sort of sense of superiority between the secular and the religious actors.
Y cuando hablamos, digamos, de estos actores seculares, por supuesto que estamos hablando muchas veces de grandes hombres de negocios. Entonces, el mensaje social de las comunidades judías es muy limitado en América Latina.
And when we talk about the secular actors, they tend to be businessmen or important economic actors. So clearly the social message is not particularly pervasive in Latin America.
Y cuando hablamos de las comunidades musulmanas, hablamos, por supuesto, de comunidades que hoy en día en América Latina fundamentalmente trabajan en temas de conversión de no musulmanes al Islam.
And when we speak about Muslim communities in Latin America, one of the issues is the issue of proselytizing and conversion of non-Muslim communities into Muslim.
Sin embargo, en el Caribe encontramos comunidades musulmanas muy distintas que trabajan a todos los niveles de la sociedad y responden a problemas sociales que en América Latina las comunidades musulmanas no buscan trabajar.
In the Caribbean, it's a little bit different. And in the Caribbean, we do find Muslim communities that are working on social issues sort of a little bit different from the rest of the continent.
Y en el caso, digamos, de las espiritualidades indígenas, afrodescendientes, los problemas centrales de ellos es recuperar identidad y, por supuesto, los temas de pobreza, desarrollo, no están en sus prioridades.
And when we speak about indigenous spirituality or Afro-descending traditions, one of the issues is more about maintaining their identity and not so much focusing on the social issues, even though they're clearly a problem.
Pese a que la pobreza está radicada fundamentalmente en esos sectores.
And poverty tends to be focused very much on these sectors of the population.
Y una línea cross-cutting, una línea transversal que encontramos en todas las principales comunidades religiosas es el problema de la teología de la prosperidad y cómo eso de alguna manera afecta el trabajo para el desarrollo y la lucha contra la pobreza.
And he's saying that one cross-cutting issue among many of the religious groups is the issue of the prosperity gospel and how to improve the lives of people.
Y por supuesto, cuando hablamos de teología de la prosperidad, no estamos hablando de lucha contra la pobreza, porque eso arruinaría completamente el negocio de la teología de la prosperidad.
And he's saying that actually, when we speak about prosperity gospel, we're not actually speaking about poverty reduction, as that would, in some ways, undermine the whole point of the prosperity gospel.
Y son muchas veces las iglesias que más crecen en América Latina, como vemos el caso de las iglesias neopentecostales en el Brasil.
And in some cases, these are actually the churches that are growing the most in Latin America, as we can see with the Pentecostal churches in Brazil.
Pero tampoco no podemos decir que solamente es un tema de los neopentecostales, es decir, también vemos en la Iglesia Católica grupos muy importantes que, aunque no los llamamos teología de la prosperidad, están fuertemente vinculados con ella, como por ejemplo los Legionarios de Cristo, que en los últimos años han sido una noticia en todos los medios de comunicación.
However, this phenomenon is not exclusive to the Pentecostal churches. We can also see it in the Catholic orders. I'm not sure I'm going to translate this properly, but the Legionnaires of Christ, is that correct? That would be one group which, although Catholic, seems to have some clear links to the prosperity gospel.
Y cuando vemos, por ejemplo, una comunidad judía como la de Panamá, fundamentalmente formada por hombres de negocios, vemos ahí claramente un ejemplo de teología de la prosperidad. Uno visita la comunidad judía de Panamá, son alrededor de 10.000 personas, pero uno encuentra rabinos de todo el mundo que vienen a recaudar fondos a Panamá, e incluso, y mayormente, incluso una comunidad mayormente sefaradí, y uno encuentra un montón de rabinos que no son sefaradim, que vienen a Panamá a buscar dinero. Y es que la teología de la prosperidad está muy profundamente arraigada, la idea de que tú donas y vas a tener tus negocios van a prosperar aún mucho más.
So one example that is being discussed is the Jewish community in Panama, which is about 10,000 people, and it is made up mostly of businessmen. So he finds that this has actually been an interesting case because rabbis from all over the world and of different backgrounds will come to Panama to seek money, to seek funds. So the thinking is if you give money, your business will do better, and that's sort of how the whole thing works.
Entonces, en este panorama es por supuesto muy difícil poder muchas veces situar los temas de pobreza y desarrollo, y muchas veces son solamente minorías quienes realmente están comprometidas con estos temas.
So within this panorama, it is really difficult to have people focus on the social issues and on the real poverty issues that are at stake.
Regresando a lo que hablábamos del mapeo, la verdad es que, y yo sé que Quentin y Catherine no han estado quizás totalmente contentos con el trabajo que hemos hecho, porque no siempre ha sido fácil lograr los resultados que hemos buscado.
So going back to the issue of mapping, the truth is that he feels that Catherine and Quentin may not be happy with the work that we have carried out.
Muchas veces las organizaciones no tuvieron las estadísticas que hemos necesitado y eso ha hecho muy difícil poder completar estos trabajos.
Many of the organizations don't really have readily available statistics, and this has made our work a little bit more difficult.
Ahora, por ejemplo, desde Religiones por la Paz estamos trabajando con UNDP también en una especie de mapeo encuesta, y muchos líderes religiosos no han querido colaborar porque ahí también se les pedía opiniones sobre cómo ellos ven a las Naciones Unidas, al sistema de las Naciones Unidas, a UNDP, y han preferido muchas veces abstenerse y no dar opiniones.
And also in their work with Religions for Peace and working with UNDP, they were working on a mapping/survey of religious leaders. And many religious leaders did not want to respond to the survey as it was asking for their opinions on many of these issues. They chose to abstain.
De todos modos, y eso es algo que también está en las conclusiones del trabajo que ustedes han hecho, los ODM han servido para poder de alguna manera unirnos todos mucho en este trabajo y desde Religiones para la Paz en América Latina y el Caribe hemos hecho mucho por introducir el tema de los ODM y unir a las comunidades de fe trabajando en este tema. ODM, MDG.
Okay. Nonetheless, Religions for Peace has managed to work with a lot of different organizations and trying to work towards the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals in Latin America.
También Catherine nos preguntaba sobre los desafíos que enfrentamos ahora.
Catherine also asked us to speak a little bit about the challenges that we've been facing in our work.
Y este fin de semana hubo una noticia para mí un poco sorpresiva. Quienes siguen las noticias del Vaticano lo habrán leído, quienes no están tan cerca del tema quizás no tengan la información.
And this weekend they received some surprising news, or at least surprising to him, about the Vatican.
Hubo una reunión la semana pasada del Consejo Especial para América, del Sínodo de los Obispos de la Iglesia Católica, que se reunió en el Vaticano.
There was a meeting of the Bishops' Conference of the Catholic Bishops.
De Synod.
Okay.
The Special Council for America of the Official Synod. Yes, at the Vatican. Okay. Y la sorpresa para mí fue que ellos vienen teniendo reuniones acerca de lo que ellos llaman la nueva evangelización, un tema muy importante hoy para la Iglesia Católica.
One of the issues they were discussing was the new evangelization within the Catholic Church.
And the Catholic Church.
In the Catholic Church.
Pero lo interesante fue que ellos no hablaron en esta oportunidad, dentro del tema de la nueva evangelización, han hablado acerca del diálogo ecuménico e interreligioso. Y eso para mí fue muy extraño, porque la Iglesia Católica en América Latina muy poco se ha interesado sobre este tema.
And the surprising part of this was that the discussion centered on ecumenical interfaith dialogue, which is not something that they typically talk about in Latin America.
Y también lo interesante fueron las conclusiones que han habido de esta reunión, porque este Consejo Especial para América no solo incluye a líderes de la Iglesia Latinoamericana, sino también de la Iglesia de los Estados Unidos y de Canadá.
And the special council included members not only from the Latin American churches, but also from the United States and Canada.
Y ellos han escrito, han puesto una declaración en la cual ellos reclaman que no está bien la forma en cómo el Estado está trabajando interreligiosamente con las comunidades de fe.
And in their declaration, they stated that they were not in agreement with the way that the governments are dealing sort of among different faiths with the communities on the ground.
Yes. En los últimos años, muchos gobiernos en América Latina se han acostumbrado a trabajar interreligiosamente diferentes problemas, es decir, a consultar a varias comunidades de fe o a todas las comunidades de fe sobre los problemas de Estado en América Latina.
So in Latin America, many of the governments have actually been working through different religious leaders and consulting with different religious groups on some of the issues at hand.
Y ahora vemos un documento de la Iglesia Católica abiertamente opuesto a esta actitud de los gobiernos.
And so the document that came out of this meeting was actually actively opposing the way that these governments are consulting with all the different religions.
Y ustedes se preguntarán por qué. Bueno, la razón es que la Iglesia Católica considera que de esta forma, al ubicarse en forma igual a otros grupos de fe, está perdiendo no se le está reconociendo su lugar histórico en nuestras sociedades.
And you may ask yourselves why the Catholic Church would oppose that the government speak with all the different religious groups. And the reason is that they are feeling like they're not receiving their place as the largest religious community in Latin America and sort of losing their place as the largest historical member, I mean, obviously religious group as well in Latin America.
Y también porque cuando los estados reúnen a líderes religiosos, ellos no hacen selección de acuerdo a un criterio teológico. Ellos ven grupos religiosos importantes y reúnen esos grupos teológicos importantes. Y la Iglesia Católica se ve obligada a sentarse con grupos religiosos con los cuales no quisiera sentarse.
So when governments do go around trying to find members of different religious groups to speak to, they don't necessarily do it. It's not a very I don't know, how shall we say, rigorous process of selection. So the Catholic Church often finds themselves sitting at the table with other religious communities with which they really do not have any desire to meet.
Y por otra parte, vemos en el documento de la Iglesia Católica cómo ellos se refieren claramente a los grupos indígenas como religiones que tienen que ser, corregidas de su antigua espiritualidad y traídas a la Iglesia Católica.
And in this document, they refer to many indigenous religious groups as groups that need to be whose theology needs to be corrected and brought back into sort of the Catholic tradition.
La Iglesia Católica habla de que hay que purificar a los grupos indígenas
And speaks of purifying these indigenous groups
para traerlos de regreso a la Iglesia Católica.
to bring them into the Catholic Church.
No sabemos qué consecuencias va a tener este documento, pero esperamos que no afecte nuestro trabajo interreligioso en la región.
And we have no idea what sort of impact this document will have, but we sincerely hope that it will not affect the interfaith work that we've been undertaking for the last few years.
Acerca del futuro, también Catherine nos pregunta qué ideas tenemos acerca de los próximos pasos para dar. 2-3 minutes.
Okay, and lastly, Catherine asked us to speak about the next steps and what we think we should do now.
El primer tema importante, creo yo, es cuál va a ser el papel de los grupos de fe en los nuevos procesos de integración regional.
And the first thing he wants to talk about is the role of faith-based organizations and the processes of regional integration that are taking place.
Nosotros estamos cambiando los espacios de integración regional. Si antes el más importante ha sido la OEA o han sido incluso la Comunidad Iberoamericana en los últimos 20 años, hoy vemos como que los gobiernos de América Latina están construyendo otros espacios de integración regional.
In Latin America, there are new sort of waves of regional integration that are going beyond the traditional Organization of American States or other sort of continental regional bodies.
Like the Ibero-American Community. Y ahora vemos espacios de integración que nacen desde América Latina, pero que tienen también una fuerte participación de gobiernos que no son ejemplos de democracias y de participación de la sociedad civil.
And many of these groups that are coming out of Latin America have participation from governments that are not necessarily democratic and who are not very concerned with civil society movements.
Y por supuesto tampoco de las comunidades de fe.
And of faith-based
Y son,
communities.
digamos,
either.
espacios de integración, como por ejemplo la comunidad de estados latinoamericanos y caribeños, o UNASUR en Sudamérica, que no están pensando en la participación de la sociedad civil, ni tampoco en protección de derechos humanos, como por ejemplo es el caso de la Organización de Estados Americanos.
Okay, and some of these organizations, one of them being the Caribbean, I'm not sure what the translation is for the
The
Caribbean.
Community of Latin American Caribbean States and the Union of South American Nations.
Okay, some of these regional bodies are not necessarily concerned about human rights. These are not one of the issues that they're looking at, and they're also not looking at civil society organizations. They don't really want them to be part of this movement. It's just more on a government
En estos
basis.
momentos se piensa, por ejemplo, que la integración regional es muy importante, por ejemplo, la relación con China. Y uno se pregunta qué diálogo político vamos a tener con China si ellos tienen un enfoque de derechos humanos muy diferente a nosotros.
And lastly, one of the issues is the relationship with China. So in Latin America, this has become a very prominent issue. And the question is, how can we forge a relationship with China when they have a very different point of view on human rights than that which we would like to have in Latin America?
Y tres temas más. Seguridad ciudadana es un tema muy importante en que las comunidades religiosas debemos participar, podemos trabajar juntos, los temas de migración y todo lo que tiene que ver con la juventud, porque somos un continente joven y tenemos problemas de juventud muy serios, porque hay una gran diferencia entre la cultura de las comunidades de fe y la cultura secular, que es la cultura de los jóvenes.
Okay, and there are three more issues which we want to focus on, one of which is citizen security, another one of which is migration, and the last one would be youth, and especially the sort of secular and religious divide within Latin American youth.
Muchas gracias y especialmente a Claudia por ayudarme.
Thank you.
We are running over our time, and as a result, we're going to entertain two questions, not comments, questions. If you have two questions, quickly, if you could direct them to someone on the panel, leave your other comment to a little later when we'll have a little bit more time. So are there any questions that people have? If they don't, then thank you very much. Next panel.
We have a 15-minute break,
Okay.
so some coffee.